Thanks, Fiona, and hello, everyone. Really nice to meet you. Thanks for having me. Um, as Fiona said, I'm going to talk with you about impact evaluation, and there are many ways that you could take this conversation. You've probably all had some pretty technical ones at various points. Um, there are data scientists who work on this and people with PhDs who work on this. Um, I'm none of those things, but I have worked for funders for 15 years now and have been in a lot of rooms where we've had conversations about the kinds of information that ventures and social entrepreneurs have and how they're making use of that data and what questions that leads funders to have about their work. And so I'm excited to talk with you a little bit about that perspective. And I hope that we can really make this a conversation. So please feel free to, whenever you want, jump off mute, jump in the chat. And speaking of, maybe we start with, as everyone's kind of coming in, why don't you introduce yourself in the chat? Tell me your name, tell me your venture, just so I have a sense of who you are. So name and venture in the chat when you've got a sec. And Somali, while that's happening, would you mind pulling up the slides? I think we can jump all the way probably to number 3. Hello, Mary. Hi, Christian. Hi, Mia. Hi, Abdurrahman. Hi, Susan. Um, I'm excited to learn a little bit more about the work all of you are doing um, as we go. But let's just start with as you're dropping in information about yourselves and your ventures. What do you think of when I say impact evaluation? What are kind of ideas or phrases or words that come to mind? Impact evaluation. Thanks, Mia. People affected and helped. Definitely, I think one of the ways that I like to think about it, Mary, measurement. Yes, we're going to talk about measurement today. Rukia, how helpful it is for the intended. Oh, yes, I love that. I think not just how many but to what extent. I think that's a great way to think about it. Outcomes, yes. Thanks, Christian. Somali, would you mind jumping to the next slide? So here's the definition I use of impact evaluation in my work, and it's that impact evaluation are the processes that help you understand what changes can be attributed to your work, to your program, or to your project. And all the things that you all said, the people that are affected and measurement and how much people are helped by the work, the outcomes, all that's kind of built underneath that of the changes that can be attributed. I'll start before we go into sort of what does that really mean and what does that mean for you. I'll start with a little bit of framing about things that are not included when and often when other funders talk about impact evaluation. We're not here talking about program evaluation. And program evaluation is when you're monitoring the kind of efficiency of your work or the fidelity of your work. So that's when you're measuring things like, is this program, are people satisfied with this program? Or is this program being implemented in the way that it's supposed to be? Impact evaluation is also not about tracking your operating metrics or your business metrics. So it's not about your KPIs. It's not about your revenue. It's not about your expenses. All of those things, your program evaluation metrics and your operating metrics, are really important to measure. You should be measuring them as entrepreneurs. And you may even have a single dashboard that you and your leadership team are looking at together along, with impact evaluation, program evaluation, and business metrics all at the same time. but they are different things and they have different purposes and different types of conversations. So today we're really just going to focus on that first, that impact evaluation piece. That's often the part that the funder is going to care most about, because they care about to what extent are you really making a change in the world. They're going to want to know that they can trust that you have all the other ones kind of handled. They want to know that you're running efficiently. They want to know you're running effectively. They want to know that you as a leader have a handle on your business metrics and are thinking about, for example, the financial sustainability and the engagement of your team. But they're not going to want to get into the meat of it typically. They just want to know that you've got it handled. And then you, as leaders, as you're making decisions and running your organizations day to day, you're going to need to use these different types of information in different ways to make decisions. But we're going to focus today on that top bullet, the impact evaluation piece. So Somali, we'll go on. So goals of impact evaluation. Impact evaluation can help you learn a few different things and help you do a few different things. I think we most often think about this green square here, reporting and sharing results. Super important, definitely a part of the puzzle. It's the part that comes out when we're talking about funders, but you all are leaders and you don't have time to be collecting and analyzing data just to report it to someone else. You should be using that data and it should be informing and strengthening your work. You care about the outcomes of your work because you care about the people that you're helping and because you want to make sure that your program is as strong as it can be and helping as many people as deeply as possible. And so that's why we use impact evaluation data in these other ways. We use it to determine the ROI of an intervention. ROI is return on investment. So that's our way of saying, how much bang are we getting for the buck? How much results, how many units of results, how much outcomes are we getting for the amount of dollars and time and effort and energy we're putting into this program? We should be using impact evaluation data to learn and adapt. So we want to see in our data who's being affected, how much are they being affected, who's not being affected, why not, and how does that influence our program? So I'll give you an example. Perhaps you're collecting data on your program and you're finding that youth who are 10 to 14 are showing great growth, but youth 15 to 24 in your program, not so much. And so what does that tell you? That tells you just that. But what do you do with it? You use it to then adapt and make decisions. So maybe a decision you make is, well, actually my program's better suited for younger children, and so we're going to go all in on that population. Or maybe you say, my program is really meant to work with that whole spectrum from 10 to 24. So what I need to do is figure out why it's not fully reaching those older youth, and I need to adjust my program for that population. And that gets me into that dark blue square at the bottom, informing future strategies and priorities. Once your data comes in, that's the kind of operation, that's the opportunity for you to say, here's what I want to do in the future. In the future, I'm just going to prioritize those young people, or in the future, I'm going to prioritize the way that my program needs to be adapted to meet the needs of older youth. And that's going to be kind of where my attention and energy are going to lie as a leader. Before we get into this next bit, which is a little bit different, any kind of questions, reactions to what I've sort of shared so far about the definition of impact evaluation and the kind of why behind it?
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay. My question, if at a point where maybe you are not directly measuring, I've learned that impact evaluation is not necessarily program or implementation evaluation. If you're at the point whereby maybe your venture you are not very keen on measuring that, what could be your advice, especially when you pitching to funders?
Susie, what a beautiful bridge to this next slide. So maybe I'll go into this and I'm going to answer that question while I do that. Thank you for asking that. I'll preview the answer to your question, which is partially the last bullet here. So you as a social entrepreneur ideally are able to communicate the work, the impact of your organization to date, including your performance on your top couple of metrics. If you're not yet measuring outcomes, you need to be able to communicate and frankly convince a funder that there's something out there that demonstrates that your model is effective, even if you don't have your own data. So that might be, maybe you have examples from other similar programs that have been run elsewhere or with other populations that were promising, and you're building on that model, right? So you're building on a proven model. Maybe you have a tiny pilot that you collected data on. Maybe you ran it with 3 people in the past and you have data that show that for those 3 people, it made a difference. So now that you're scaling up to 15, even though you don't yet have data on that 15, you have some sense that it's probably going to work. There needs to be some reason. There's some reason that you've designed your program in the way that you have, right? Like it didn't just come to your head. You're building it off of something. Maybe the evidence that demonstrates it is input you have from community members. There's some sort of evidence that you have that informed how you designed this, and that is really important in telling your story. All that said, you should very quickly be collecting some kind of data on your work. You kind of from the beginning, you need to be tracking what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what the results are as you go along, even if it takes you quite some time to get to what's the final long-term result. Taking a step back a little bit more on this slide. So this slide, the information on the slide, I'm calling your impact model, but the kind of overall point here is that every social entrepreneur, in order to be able to have an effective conversation with a funder about their work, needs to have a succinct and clear way of communicating all of this information. What need or opportunity does your organization address? Sort of like what in the world are you meant to help? How does it address that need? And how does it do so uniquely, differently, better than anyone else? And that answer may be because no one else is doing this, or no one else is doing this here, or no one else is doing this with this group, or the other people that are doing this are missing this important aspect that I've built in that makes it more effective. The desired impact. So what we are trying to do is help all youth better have more voice in their local government, or help help all youth speed up their skill building as it relates to a specific area. But you need to be able to say what you're trying to do. What's your approach for achieving impact? So this is the thing that you're doing. Are you providing tutoring? Are you providing empowerment opportunities? Are you providing materials that enable people to then build their own something? What is the thing that you're doing? What are the current programs that you're running? So if you are providing tutoring, but the program that you're providing has sort of more services wrapped around it, what does that look like? What's the current scope and scale of your work? Sometimes we also refer to this as outputs or reach. So this is how many people are you serving, or how many units of farming tools are you giving away, or what is the number of the thing? How do you define and measure impact? Here, I say your top 1 to 3 priority metrics that you're tracking. The reason I say that is because what I see often when it comes to ventures is one of 2 things. Either you have no data or you have too much data, and it's hard to find that sweet spot in the middle where you're saying, my North Star is really just about literacy for young adults. What we're focusing on literacy for young adults, and that is measured by this particular measure, and that's our North Star. There are many other things that I do care about. I want to know, are those young adults happier when, feeling more satisfied? I want to know if those young adults are progressing in school or getting work, or are their families doing better financially? There are many, 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 many things I care about that are kind of secondary, tertiary. But to start, you got to kind of have a center, and you got to focus on the things that are most closely tied to your work. And so you have to figure out what those are. And then the last piece, Susie, this is sort of to your question. What have your results been on that one metric? What have your results been on youth literacy to date? And how have you kind of performed on those? I don't know that I'm allowed to do this, but I'm going to do this. I suggest that all of you, for homework, like this week, sit down and write this, and then say it out loud. And if you've got co-founders, have them do the same thing and say it out loud to each other, and refine it and practice it and shorten it and get it tighter. You should be able to tell me this whole story in 3 minutes. And then I, as a funder, I'm going to dig in deeper on this one nugget that I think is interesting. As you get to, so that's kind of like version 101 of this is being able to capture that story and tell that story. Version 201, 301, the future is then being able to shape the story for your individual audience, keeping the core of the story the same, being able to tell every funder what you do, why you do it, and the results, but being able to say, for this funder that cares the most about women and girls, here's how this has a specific impact on women and girls. But for this other funder who really cares broadly about agriculture, here's what this means for and for ag. So I know that was a lot. I'm hopeful that Somali and Fiona and team can also share out these questions after, so everyone can have them kind of in front of them. Mary, go ahead.
Yes. So when you're saying like we have to be able to answer all of these questions in those 3 minutes, like morphing all of them into like one little short giant. Sorry, I'm like short giant thing. I'm still stuck a little bit on the slides that you did before ADHD. My brain is kind of like still stuck on it. You talked about like impact not being measuring KPIs or things like that, but aren't those tools that are able to help you like answer those questions on like determining the interventions or learning how to adapt or informing strategies? Aren't those tools to kind of like, sorry, I got confused a little bit with those first few slides. Sorry for taking one back.
Yeah, I think the reason that you're confused is because it's confusing. They are interrelated, and everything that you do in your venture holistically contributes to the results, right? What I'm trying to disentangle here is when you're communicating with funders, there are some things that are just kind of the baseline foundation of operating as an organization that you have to do in order for your organization to deliver results, but aren't the story of how the results are delivered. So let me give you an example. Let's take our tutoring and literacy example. You've got a venture, it provides tutoring, and it's meant to increase literacy for young adults in a community. In order for that organization to deliver tutoring and improve literacy, you have to hire and train tutors, right? That's part of the activities. And you're probably going to have KPIs as a leader about what your hiring pipeline looks like and what your retention rate is for tutors. That's all really important information for you to make decisions on how much money you need to spend and how much time you need to spend getting out the word and building a pipeline for more tutors, right? Like that's all really important. But if I'm a funder and what I care about is, does this thing really increase literacy? And you only have 3 minutes, don't spend your 3 minutes telling me about how you have a 80% retention rate of tutors, but you're going out there to hire a bunch more tutors. Tell me about how your tutoring model really targets this thing specifically in literacy that no one else is doing. And so what we're seeing is that the students, the youth who participate in your tutoring program have increased literacy by 25%, which is so much more than anyone else does, right? Like that's where you want to focus the story. That's the results story. I also say that in terms of, as you're making decisions in terms of where to dedicate your time and resources, let's take the example I gave before. Your impact data showing you that literacy is really increasing with half of your participants, but not so much with your other half. That should tell you, because your end goal isn't hiring tutors, you're retaining tutors, your end goal is literacy.
Yeah.
Like that is the fact that should drive how you make a decision. And the decision could be go all in on the population for whom you're making a difference, or the decision could be fix your program so that it helps everyone, right? Like, but that's where kind of your leadership judgment comes in. Maybe we go on, Somali, to the next. Okay, so impact evaluation. If you've Googled impact evaluation or had some kind of early trainings on it or seen it elsewhere, you've probably seen some of these terms. You've probably heard of a theory of change. What I'm going to share here is these are all terms that you should become kind of fluent in and able to use, but don't get too stuck in a kind of framework. And the reality is what matters is gathering data, making sense of data, making decisions, and using data. Like that's what the kind of core of everything is. But this matters because there are going to be a lot of funders, particularly government funders who are going to really focus on this language. And I think it's also important to disentangle what these different things are so you know which one you're talking about. So what are we talking about? Activities. Activities are the things that you do to achieve your goal. So in the case of the example that we were talking about before, tutoring, right? Tutoring is an activity. You are giving sessions and lessons, right? Outputs are earlier when we were talking about the reach or scale. That's the kind of number of units delivered. So it could be, in our tutoring example, number of people tutored or number of tutoring sessions or tutoring hours delivered. This is a really important measure of kind of efficiency and ROI. Are you able to deliver a lot of sessions for a reasonable investment? But it isn't exactly impact because it's not telling you to what extent those sessions are converting into literacy results. So again, this is something that you're going to want to know and track in order to talk about efficiency. But we really have to get to this bottom row of outcomes and impact to talk about, again, like results and impact. So outcomes are the results of those outputs. In our example, it's to what extent are those tutoring hours converting into literacy improvements? And then impacts are bigger, broader, and often you're not going to be able to solely say that they're attributable to you, but you're contributing to them. So in our example, your outcome might be improve literacy for the students in your program. An impact might be over the whole region. There may be some large data sets that's showing that better literacy rates overall. You haven't touched all of those people and you have no way of proving that you actually improved literacy and reading levels across an entire province, but you're part of that story. And so that's part of the ways in which you might frame your work. So all of these are important. You should be able to articulate all of these. You should know what your activities and outputs are. But when we're talking about impact, it's really that bottom row, particularly outcomes, that we're going to want to focus on. Okay, on to the next. Measurement and data. So there are many ways to show change. This is where you as leaders are going to have to come in and use your judgment about what kind of data is possible to gather and then helpful for you in informing your work. So some examples are comparing to a baseline. So comparing to when you started, comparing year over year. So, this year we've increased literacy X% more than last, comparing to a control group. So looking at other youth in the community who have similar kind of characteristic. Maybe they're also 12 to 15 years old, but they are not in your program. And what is their literacy rate? There are many different types of data. This could be your own observations. You could be surveying people and having them self-report. You could collect polling data, so big, broad data, or pulling down polling data from public data sets. Big, broad data about things like what are overall literacy rates in a community. You may be in our literacy example, maybe there's school records, right? Maybe there's grades or test results that you can be pulling. But I think what's important is this next line, which is start by measuring what you can and expand over time. So start with tracking what you can observe and using publicly available data. And then over time, as you have a more nuanced sense of what it is that you need and a little more time and space and resources, then you can start getting deeper. We've been talking about this a little bit sort of all along, but you've got to make sure you're using the data. There's as I mentioned, I keep seeing organizations where they have either kind of no data or more commonly too much data and they don't know how to use it and it just kind of sits there. That doesn't help anyone. So what you need to look at is how that data can inform how you make decisions. And I added this line here. This may be where AI is helpful for you, right? If you found yourself with reams of data and you don't know kind of what to do with it, what are the ways in which AI can help you summarize or make sense or analyze data so that you can then make better decisions? I will also say, because AI is so hot these days, such a buzzword, it's likely to be appealing to some large number of funders to hear the ways in which you're doing that to become more efficient and to be using your data more. And finally, but not last but not least, How are you including your participants and your communities in impact evaluation? As you're thinking about what data to collect, get their input. What they may know about data that's available that you don't, or they may have questions that are essential for you to answer in the data because they're really important stakeholders. And without their kind of engagement and participation, none of this exists, right? So in our tutoring example, what do the tutoring students or their parents or their family members want to most know? Do they want to most know that their students are passing the next grade at school at a faster rate? If so, that's really important data for you to collect. Maybe we'll pause for a second, and then before we go on to the more explicit funders point, what reactions do people have? Who here kind of feels like they have a sense of what their impact model and story is? Now, I'm not going to ask you to share it, but who feels like they've got it and who feels like this is something to kind of new to work on?
Okay, I think I can go first. On my end, like you've said, it's quite confusing at the start. I think as I go on reviewing the materials, I know that I'll get more familiar with exactly. But I think what I have gotten from this is the theory of change, which I've been actually well familiar with, but I just didn't know how well it fit into what I was doing. And I actually didn't know that it was important. I learned about it. I learned it very well, and I knew how to use it. I just didn't know it was actually important to help. In fact, when you mentioned it, I've actually thought, oh my God, actually this can help me even better align my my impact and also know exactly what my project is actually doing. Yeah. So thanks.
That's awesome. And I think that we overcomplicate theories of change and make them into this like fancy flow chart with a lot of boxes and arrows, and that distracts from the reality of what a theory of change is. A theory of change is a hypothesis. It's an if-then statement. And frankly, a theory of change, your theory of change could be one sentence. It could be, if I deliver tutoring in this specific way, then it will improve literacy for this population. That's a theory of change. And that can be a base on which you can build programming. And then all this data and this impact evaluation thing we're talking about, it's your experiment. It's testing your hypothesis, right? So theory of change, awesome. Also sometimes overly complicated. I'm gonna say your name wrong and I'm sorry, but Kudak Washe?
Yeah, that's actually correct.
Oh, yes.
Okay, I think this has been helpful, but what's usually confusing for us is how to change, like you have changed the main focusing on, right? And now how do you change that a little bit? Because you don't focus on one thing, but there's like this main thing you're doing. But now you're now talking to different funders. Like, how do you manage that without drifting away very much from like the thing that you're focusing on?
I'm sorry, it was a little hard to hear, but I think you were saying, how do you tell the story for different funders that care about different things? And how do you make sure that that doesn't change your work? Yeah. Is that right? Yeah. I mean, there's not a simple answer to that. It's a really hard answer. I'll say a couple things. One is, and I think we're going to get a little into this as we get to what are funders looking for. One is you've got to find the funders who are going to be relevant to you, and there are going to be plenty of funders out there who just aren't, because they're not going to focus on what you're focusing on. Two is many funders are going to ultimately recognize, if they're smart and if they're good, recognize that you are the expert and you are the leader relative to them in this thing that you're doing, right? Like you're the one doing the work. And so there's this importance of you demonstrating your leaderliness, right? Demonstrate your confidence. This is where you're telling the story, you're showing the data, you are standing up as a leader and explaining why the thing that you're measuring is actually the most important thing. You got to still often tell them the story of how it connects. And in our example before with tutoring, maybe the tutoring's for everyone, but this funder only cares about women and girls. So then you're going to have to tell, like, focus the story, the data that you're telling on the data, particularly for the girls in your program. But that doesn't mean you're changing it so that you're only working with girls, right? Like it's just as you tell the story to that particular audience, you tell the story about that subset of your participants more. If you want to put in the chat, like if there are more specific if there are more specific kind of examples from your venture that you want to share, I can see if we can sort of talk it through together live, or also happy to on email afterwards. I'll drop my email in here. Mary, I see you have your hand up.
Yes. Is this the pitch? The questions?
Is it a pitch?
Is it the pitch?
It is part of a pitch,
Okay.
but I am going to argue that you never lead with the pitch. You lead with the introduction and the overview, and a pitch is kind of comes later. You start with building the relationship, and this is the first step in building the relationship. There are sometimes there's some big RFP or kind of application where you're just going to go straight into requesting funds. But most of the time when you're working with funders, you start with getting to know them and them getting to know you. And this is kind of essential to that first piece. And then you want to make them curious. You want to make them hungry. And then you're making the pitch later.
Okay. Just like a follow-up to that, on the last question, how do you define measurements and impact? I think my brain is still stuck under what impacts are. And for someone like me, I would go probably measurements. My brain is like, how do we even measure our own success? And for me, it will go back to that like 100% retention rate, which you're like, probably not go there. So how do you talk about measurements without talking about those, let's say 100% this percentage, or if you could just clarify that last section. And I know it's all about data.
So it's not that percents don't matter. It's that it's measuring the right percent thing. So it may be that I'm going to stick with our tutoring example because it's helpful for me to have a specific example to be talking about. It may be that having retention of students in your program is actually what makes the difference. Maybe there are 10 tutoring programs out there, but all the other tutoring programs, students only persist through half of it and then they leave, and so they don't have the literacy results. Your program has a 100% retention rate for the whole length of the program, and therefore it has the literacy results that you want. In that case, the story you're telling is your retention rate, because that's what differentiates you from all the other programs. And then you're telling the story of the results at the end, which is the literacy. What I'm saying is, what you don't want to be telling them is, if the conversation's about impact, you don't tell them about operations. And the example I gave before of the retention of your tutors is fundamentally more about the operations of your venture than it is about the results of your venture. So thinking about the difference between what is an input versus what is a result. Always telling the stories of results when you're having a conversation about impact, not telling the stories about inputs. Awura.
Hi. So I just want to follow from what Mary was asking about, but mine is more towards how do you measure impacts of things that seem intangible? For example, say the baseline of your project is to change mindsets or influence people to act a certain way, right? And maybe what you're trying to use is reading to do that. I'm wondering what kind of process you can use to measure something like that so as to get the evaluation, the impact evaluation that you're looking for.
I'm going to give you a generalized answer to that. The like actual answer is it depends, right? It depends what belief you're trying to bring about, or what mindset change you're trying to bring about, and with whom, and what data is available. But a generalized, and I'm, again, feel free to email me after and we can talk about it and I can give you some more examples, but a generalized answer on mindset change is there are a few options. So one is you could start with a baseline by surveying a whole group of people about what their current sets of beliefs are, interviewing a whole bunch of people about what their beliefs are. A second is you can look at behavior change. So it may be that if you change people's beliefs about a certain thing, that tends to change their behavior around that thing, and therefore you're observing changes in behavior. So for example, take a really basic public health example that I think I used in an earlier slide. Maybe you want to change people's beliefs about the spread of germs. And so what you're going to try to do is you're going to focus on hand washing. You're going to tell people that, like, germs spread by not having clean hands, and we touch each other, and think about all the stuff we talked about with COVID all the time, right? So then what you're going to measure, what you're going to observe are how often are people washing their hands. But what you actually care about, the change that you're actually bringing about, is their belief in how germs spread, right? Like, that's the thing you really care about, but you can't observe what's happening inside their mind. So you're observing the behavior that comes from it. Obviously overly simplified, but whatever, go with me. And then another way is big polling data. So I'll give you an example. In my work right now, one of the things that we're running is a series of projects and programs to celebrate excellent public school teachers. And one of the things that we want to measure over time is how does celebrating excellent public school teachers change teachers' perceptions of their field and how long they're likely to stay in their jobs. So we are looking at big polling data that national firms are collecting on teacher sentiment. It's called teacher sentiment polling data. It's publicly available. I Googled it and I found it online, and they do run, some of these surveys are run annually. And I'm just looking at that, and I'm looking at change over time, specifically in the geographies in which we're running our programs, and saying, is this moving? We're not the only thing moving it, right? But are we contributing to specific aspects of this moving? If I had more detailed questions, I might even commission a polling firm to conduct this polling myself. That's big and expensive and not something that you're going to do right away, but like those are things that you can do. So surveying people, looking at behavior change that relates to the mindset change, and or looking at big data, publicly available data sets that you may be able to find from government or polling firms or even media agencies. Let's go through the other things, and then we can pause and talk some more. So funders. We've seen a very positive shift, I would say, over the past 5 years or so, as it relates to impact evaluation and data. And I think that's a good story. So it used to be that we were really looking at gathering reams and reams of data and doing this long-term expensive data collection and producing. We cared about things like randomized controlled trials as the only way to prove that something mattered, and that funders would have, hand you, I think, we were talking about this before, funders would hand you a stack of all the metrics they cared about, and that's the only thing you should be looking at. And like, I'm not going to lie, some funders are still in that space, but I think the field in general is moving towards a world in which evaluation is a tool for learning versus purely a tool for accountability. And we're moving into a world in which you as the leader are really central in setting the agenda as it relates to impact evaluation and metrics. And so a few ways that that's playing out. One is we care more about prioritized data that's useful. We care about seeing that you're using that data, that you're analyzing it, perhaps with AI, with humans in the loop, and that you're using it to inform decisions and strategies and operations. We want to see ongoing data collection and analysis live rather than just at the end of the program. So I think, Susie, maybe you asked early on, like, what do I do if I don't have data? Like, you start collecting data, and the data that you're collecting isn't going to tell the whole story because you're not done. That's okay. What that data is showing you is what's happening so far, and it's giving you the space to kind of tweak as you go along. And we're moving from a world, thankfully, in which funders are dictating the metrics to ones in which you all are, ideally with input from your other stakeholders. And what that does is that kind of reinforces your role as the leader and your kind of clarity about purpose and priorities. We've talked about this a bunch already, but the version, again, 101 is being able to answer those questions on your impact model. 201 or 301 or whatever is, how do you contextualize your and your venture story in your previous history with the funder's own priorities, and what's happening even in the broader environment. So here in the US, there have been major funding shifts. The federal government has defunded a lot of social impact and other grants. So as I'm out there talking to organizations who are pitching me for funding, I'm most impressed when they're able to clearly, specifically tell me about what they do, why they do it, and how that operates, how that functions within this funding environment. The next slide is a link to some examples of theories of change that I've shared. I don't know that we don't need to sort of talk about that, but maybe Smalley can share them after. And if anyone's curious about it, I will say, as I said before, I think these are great examples and they're like kind of complicated, and your theory of change does not need to be. So grain of salt with those. What do you all wish funders understood about your work and impact? Feel free to go off mute, put it in the chat, but what do you wish funders understood about your work and impact?
Hi, my name is Rukia. So I feel like for us at the bank, if a funder understood that access to the right information or people with the right information, with factual information, has the potential on influencing how people actually make decisions that are affecting them directly and indirectly, and how that in turn has an effect on the entire ecosystem or each and every other thing that surrounds us is very important. I feel like that would be a good thing, and that's what we do. We make sure that people have access to experts or people or databases or places with the information that they need about a particular aspect of their life.
I love that. And I think one of the reasons that's such a great example for this conversation, Rukia, is that it's not as concrete as my silly basic stories that I've been telling, right? Like it's really easy to see an input to an output when we talk about tutoring and literacy, but as we get more complex and think about access to information and the ways in which that can influence so many different results for a person, here's where I would say, in addition to data, remember that storytelling is a huge part of impact results. And Rukia, like the more that you can tell detailed stories, you should have a whole, like database of stories, and then you pick which story you're telling based on that particular funder's interest. But here's a way in which access to data improves someone's life economically. Here's how it improves someone's civic participation. Here's how it improves someone's health. Here's how it, onward and onward and onward. And saying that this is, we have evidence, we have individual stories of the ways in which this venture can unlock so many different kind of varied results.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I would love that. I'd include that.
Quick question, sorry. Does that mean when you're telling that story, it's kind of like jumping in with the case studies?
Yes, I think that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, case studies. And remember that a case study can be a sentence, a case study can be a paragraph, and a case study can be a book, right? So finding like what's the right length of case study. Ideally, case study also has pictures. Funders, so like think of us as children. Break it down to simple language. We don't know what you're talking about because we're not experts in any of these things, and we like pictures. I'm looking at the chat that this is a long-term program that builds slowly. Love that. And I think that's where it becomes incumbent upon you to communicate what is showing you that you are making progress towards in the right direction along the way. And then tell that donor, tell that funder what it's going to take to get the rest of the way, right? How can they come on board and be part of the solution? There's so much capacity that has to be pulled to bring it to life, and capacity building funds are really important to achieve the results of the initial beneficiary. Love that. I think that's kind of relates to what I just said a moment ago, which is like, tell the story of how far you've gotten it. You as the venture leader are getting it to 65% of the way there, and you know how to get it all the way to the 100, but you need these other things to bring it there. And that's the ask, right? Like, come be part of our team and bring that on board. inclusivity. They need to have affordable agri-tech solutions for small scale farmers. Yeah, I think here's what you want them to know, but what you need to do more is what's it going to take to make them believe? And I think the case study is something that makes people believe. Big pieces of data are something that makes people believe. Believing in you as a leader, your confidence, and your clarity. Those are all things that make people believe. Half of this is data, but half of it is emotional, right? Funders are humans. What is it going to take to make them feel like and believe that what you are doing makes a difference, that you are the right one to be doing it, and that there is a place for them to contribute in your story. The last kind of slide is, these are massive and broad generalizations. Like none of this is there. You will find a million exceptions to all the things here, but I do find these like broad categories to generally be true and helpful in thinking about approaching donors. I generally segment the donor world based out by the type of donor. Are they a public sector funder, a corporation, an institutional funder? And by that, I mean a foundation that has professional staff, or are they families and small foundations that they're run usually by members of the family or very small staff? So government funders, typically compliance oriented. They're looking at outputs, they're looking at deliverables, and you should treat this like a contract. That's how the relationship is typically going to be. And they're going to look at, what did you say you were going to do? Does it match to what we said we need? Are you then delivering exactly what you said you were going to do, which matches to what we need, right? It's really like in a line, like a contract. Corporate funders are really going to care about your scale. They want to be able to tell a story like, our funding impacted 10,000 people. They're going to care less about the fact that 30 people's lives were fundamentally transformed and more that 10,000 people are touched. So as you think about what funders might be a good fit for you, are you a breadth kind of play, or are you a depth kind of play? They also care about collateral, and here's where I'm talking about pictures, videos, stories. They want to be able to share that like picture of the happy smiling child and say 10,000 of these happy smiling children are, exist because of us. Institutional funders, again, these big foundations with staff, they're thinking about contributions towards their longer term strategy. They tend to have these kind of really complicated flowchart type strategies. And then they're going to care about learning and field learning. So as you're implementing this, again, let's use our example before, you learned that by implementing tutoring in the first way, it was most meaningful for young kids, but implementing in the second way is most meaningful for older kids. That kind of knowledge that you're generating is going to be really important and helpful to them, and something that they're going to be hungry for. And then families and foundations are really going to care about the relationship, oftentimes with you as the leader. And so again, like, how are you thinking about building that and setting that up? Ideally as a partnership, where you kind of really bring something important to the table and ask them to kind of be part of the team. And those are all the things that I was going to say, but what questions do people have? What thoughts, reflections, anything you disagree with? Hit me.
I could jump in. I really love even how you are able to categorize the funders, because sometimes you be, for someone like me, I feel like the family foundations are more beneficial for me. So sometimes you find yourself applying for funds that probably don't match you. And that really becomes hard to be able to maintain those relationships. For instance, if I ever get like a government funds, like at least I'm going to treat it as a contract and just know that I need to comply with every law they want. But yeah, this was really cool.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. That was really insightful. I have a question on like the funders and applying to like grants and everything. What is like the criteria that you need to use for like, so as you know which one specifically you need to put your energy into? Because most of the time they're like 10, 20 you need to apply to. Then if you don't really put that energy in a specific one, the application won't be that good. So how do you like analyze those kind of like different funders and like grants and know what to specifically focus on? Because some of them, they just say general, they focus on different things.
I mean, that's such a big question, and it is like people's full-time job to figure out. What I'm going to drop in the chat is a few resources that I've found helpful at different times in doing that. There's no magic answer. Like, it comes down to knowing like who you are fundamentally as an organization, and you know what. Let me see if I can copy this image. And then understanding what it is that they want and trying to match it. There's like there's not a kind of magic answer that always applies. Unfortunately. Let me see if I can. There's one other doc that I would love. Here we go. Let's see if this will send. Let me know if you're able to open that.
Yes, it's opening. Thank you.
Okay.
Adra. Yeah, they have enough money. They went to give some to the University of people. Vice Chancellor, big funds, grants, students, and things like.
Okay, I'm not sure if you're talking to us, we can't quite make out what you're saying, but I think you're maybe not. But I think we're coming to our time. So if anybody has any follow-up questions or thoughts, feel free to reach out. I'm sure Somali and Fiona and team will be able to share around the slides if that's helpful. And go work on your impact models. Go do it. You got it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Helen, for such an incredible session and for sharing all these great resources. We captured those, so we will definitely share those out afterwards, and the deck and the recording. So definitely please be on the lookout for all of that. I know that I am the type of person that always realizes I have questions after a session has ended. So if you are like me and you finish this call and you're like, oh no, I have so many more questions for Helen, please let us know. We send it to the AIC email that you all would have been chatting with, and we will make sure that those get to Helen. We'll also be sharing out the confirmation email for the next session, so keep an eye on your inbox. And then last but importantly, before we log off, Somali would love to get a screenshot to share with the rest of the resolution team. If you would like your picture taken, please keep your camera on. If you would not, please feel free to turn your camera off. There is no pressure. So Somali, do you want to give us a formal countdown? Helen, you as well. You are welcome to have your camera on or off.